especially when you have cooperating with colleagues, and things like this increases the motivation level. So it's great to be here. I can say a bit about the background. So we have a research team here at the Institute for Future Studies that are doing things related to AI and democratic legitimacy and other kinds of moral philosophy, but also other like empirical issues. And I hope that, if you're interested in presenting something at our seminar that we have just started forming, that would be really great for us. So if you would be interested, you can just send me an email. Okay, so this article is about, as you might have seen the abstract, about this idea of democratic legitimacy and how it can be impacted, or how we can think about the impact of AI on the democratic decision-making or decision-making in a democracy. Okay, so here's the outline. I'm going to talk a bit about democratic legitimacy, the principle of publicity. I want to relying on the work of Thomas Cristiano. I also want to talk about how we extend the principle, or at least apply this idea to a wider set of problems, or a wider set of domains. Then I'm going to say something about how machine learning can be used in public decision making, or is being used, and the challenges to the principle of publicity from machine learning. And then give a few kind of considerations for when machine learning can be legitimate from this point of view. And I just want to, on the outset here, saying that machine learning can be legitimate yet bad in other ways, perhaps if it's inaccurate or if it's biased and so on. So this is just that a decision-making process is legitimate. It's not a sufficient condition for it to be good. It's a necessary condition. Okay, let's start. So the idea of democratic legitimacy is, it's basically a property that a public institution has, a public institution that exerts authority over citizens, for example, child protection services, courts, employment agencies, and so on. What democratic legitimacy does is that it permits that public institution to wield power, and sometimes even coercive power, over citizens. And it also implies that there is a moral requirement that subjects comply with that authority. So if authority is not legitimate, then it's wrong for this authority to wield coercive power over citizens, and citizens have no moral responsibility to obey that authority. There might be other reasons why public authority may be, you don't need to follow to comply, but legitimacy is an important one, and this is discussed a lot in political science and so on. And one of the central ideas that make a polity or a public institution legitimate is this idea of public equality. And this is an idea that's been defended by several philosophers, but most prominently by Thomas Cristiano. And the principle of publicity says that, it has two main components. The one is reason giving, and this is the idea that the decision maker, the authority, needs to provide reasons for a decision. And those reasons need to be specific to the case. So, for example, let's say that I was drunk driving, and I got caught by the police, and the police made a test, so it's they could verify that I was drunk. Then the court or the police could say that it's illegal to be drunk while you're driving, and we also have evidence that you were drunk, and therefore these are the consequences. So the important thing is that the reasons are specific to me, to this particular case. So it would not be enough for the court to say that, on this particular hour, then people are often drunk at this at this intersection, or people that drive cars like yours are often drunk. So it would not be acceptable to make a decision on the basis of kind of some statistical regularity. The reasons need to be particular to me. The second aspect is that those reasons need to be public for the relevant stakeholders. For example, lawyers, myself, of course, and perhaps journalists and so on. And I think there's been a lot of talk in the realm of AI ethics and so on about transparency, but we want to emphasize that publicity is not the same thing as transparency, also, although they are in some respects similar. So publicity just, it means that a verdict or the process by which the verdict was reached is made public to the relevant people, and it might not always be a good idea to make them completely public. For example, in the case with minors being defendants in criminal court cases, in Sweden at least, we have a rule that the identity of the child is protected, and this is makes the process less transparent in one sense, but it's not something that violates the principle of publicity. Or at least it's not something that necessarily violates the principle of publicity. So according to Thomas Cristiano, this idea of the public equality and the principle of publicity is mainly important for the democratic assembly and the executive power. So the democratic assembly needs to be public with its reasoning and with its decision making. But we argue that public equality is also important for administrative authority and judicial authority. And we're not sure that Thomas Cristiano would disagree with us. I think that he would agree with us, but well, we don't know. But we have two main reasons for why this idea should include administrative and judicial decisions. One is because it's required to determine whether administrative decision makers serve the aim of the democratic assembly. So if we don't know, for example, the reasoning behind a court when they sentence someone, then we don't know if the court takes the laws and the procedures as stipulated by the democratic assembly seriously. So that's one kind of instrumental reason for why this public equality is important. But we also, and this is perhaps a more substantive claim, that there is no strict separability between the legislative domain and the judicial and administrative domain of public authority. I mean, in one sense, there is, well, these are different branches of government, of course, but if we're interested in the legislative process, in how democratic societies craft rules and laws, then we cannot disregard the fact that those laws are not fully formed when the ink dries, so to speak, on the legislative assembly's decisions. The laws, that's just the first step in the legislative process, in the de facto legislative process. And the most obvious example of this is, of course, it's precedents as established by courts. So the courts interpret the law and apply it, and those precedents become, well, have the same force as law. But precedents are also important in an informal sense. In public agencies for public administration, the precedents are established, routines are established, analysis of the requirements are established, and so on. So the whole kind of process downstream that from the legislative domain to the grassroots bureaucrats is actually a part of the legislative process. So that's why we think that this idea should also include all branches of government that exercise power over citizens. Okay, so this brings us to machine learning algorithms. And yeah, so you are of course, you know more about this than I do, perhaps. But yeah, so we're all very familiar that the machine learning algorithms make their decisions, or based on the basis of categorizations. So, for example, a very famous case, and you probably know about this, the machine learning system Compass placed individuals in different categories on different categories on the likelihood to reoffend. By comparing the profile of these individuals with other profiles of people that got apprehended after reoffending. So if you are sufficiently similar in some respects to someone that did reoffend, then the system decides that you are likely to reoffend. And then, of course, the system does not have the final say in this case, but the courts have relatively little discretionary power to disregard the verdict of the system. So they can deviate from what the system says, but it's it's costly for them in some respects. They need to motivate it and so on. So it means that de facto what the system is doing is exercising power over a citizen on the basis of that citizen's statistical similarity to other citizens. So this would then, we argue, violate the principle of reason giving. Another problem, and this is of course something that you are very familiar with, is that machine learning systems are opaque. And this opacity, we argue, is can be broken down in a number of different kinds of opacity. And this is partly inspired by Julia Dressel's work. But we have observational opacity, so to speak. It's very difficult to inspect the code. There's also, to a considerable extent, theoretical opacity. The field of machine learning is still uncertain about, the kind of theoretical, in its theoretical understanding on why certain network architectures work, why others don't work, how many layers there should be, how much training you should have, etc., etc. So there's still kind of, the jury is still out. And there was a paper from a few years ago at NIPS that described the state of the field of machine learning as alchemy. That is, we can produce cool and effective tools, but we don't have much understanding of how we're doing it. So I don't remember the name of the author, but you can Google NIPS and alchemy. Then we have, of course, judicial opacity. And this is, of course, not always the case, but in many of the cases that we've looked at, the algorithms are actually not owned by the public administrations, but by a third party company. And they protect their algorithms, and they also, sometimes it's also secret how they collect data. So there's a kind of a whole system of capitalist or proprietary opacity around the use of these algorithms. On top of that, we have sociological opacity. This is something that Dressel names too, that this is, and hopefully this will not be a very big problem in the future, but at least at the moment, our societies have no clue how AI works. Most people have this kind of very weird sci-fi inspired idea about how AI works, that it's supposed to be some kind of magic or that it can think and so on. And this creates a lot of problems in terms of opacity, because it's often misapplied. AI systems are often misapplied, and it's also difficult for society, for example, legal scholars and journalists and so on, to understand what's going on. So that adds another layer of opacity. And finally, there's a certain sense in which machine learning systems are psychologically opaque. And by psychological opacity, we mean that machine learning systems don't really behave like people do, nor do they behave like machines often do? So let me give you an example. If you have a car, and the car, it's a bit rusty, it has kind of some problems. The capacity of the car will degrade gracefully. The car will be worse at accelerating. Maybe it will start to shake and so on. And that means that you can somehow know that, I probably need to take this car to the workshop fairly soon. But AI systems, they're not unique, but one feature that AI systems have that cars and humans have is that they don't have this graceful failure effect. Often a minor deviation can cause a catastrophic failure, and there's been multiple examples of this. You're probably familiar with all of them. When you add a couple of pixels to a stop sign, to an image of a stop sign, the cars can't see the stop sign anymore, or interpret it as something else. And the problem here being, of course, it's an obvious problem when the systems don't do what they're supposed to do. But the problem here from the perspective of opacity is that it's difficult for humans to understand the failure of machines, of these kinds of machines. So it's difficult for us to predict failure in a machine. And this kind of adds another layer. And this connects to an objection that we discuss, and that is often voiced in these circumstances, that humans are also opaque. And this is, of course, true. You can't see my brain and so on. But humans, but AI systems have these multiple layers of opacity, which means that, and these multiple layers, we argue, reinforce each other. The outcome is a situation that is much worse than with most human decision makers. And we can, of course, also add to this, but we don't discuss this in the paper, but perhaps we should, is the fact that humans can be personally accountable, whereas AI systems cannot. Of course, you can hold the company accountable. So if a company produces an AI that is, for example, biased against black people, then you can say that, okay, you need to recall this product, or you need to pay out fines and so on. So this is, of course, perfectly possible. But the problem is that our institutional systems don't have that institutional capacity at the moment for extracting accountability from third-party providers like this. And this will perhaps come in the future, but as long as we don't have those mechanisms, there's a difference in how easy it is to extract accountability from an AI system versus a human decision maker. Okay, so this sounds pretty downbeat. Does this mean that we should not use ML systems at all in the public decision making? Well, so this is, I think this opens up for the need of a more kind of complex and nuanced analysis that cannot be kind of sweeping and too general. So one of the considerations that's important is what happens at the grassroots level. So in some cases, people use the AI system much more than intended. So they perhaps because they don't have time to make their own considerations, they just follow the advice from the AI decision support system, or for some other reason, maybe for some cultural reason or for some sociological reason, people feel pressured to do what the AI system tells them to do without themselves making a judgment. But in other cases, the reverse can be true. And this seems to be the case. We did a case study here at the Swedish Public Employment Agency, where we saw that a lot of the caseworkers at the Swedish employment system, they were very unwilling to use the considerations of the AI. And it was kind of it's a kind of a fun example, because this ML system had it had an algorithm that assigned the probability of getting a job to a job seeker. But since there's a lot of noise in the system, the ML system also had a random variable. So if you, if the caseworker clicked on reevaluate many times, the verdict could change. And we have seen that many caseworkers keep clicking on the button until they get the result that they feel corresponds to their intuitions. So yeah, it can vary a lot. And these variations are important to how acceptable it is. Because a public decision, for example, in the Swedish Employment Office, is of course a decision built up from many sub-decisions. To the extent that some decisions are very kind of near to the top of the decision hierarchy, that would be more problematic than in a decision that is low in the decision hierarchy. And whether or not it's on the top or on the bottom of the decision hierarchy, so to speak, it depends on these sociological factors. Other considerations is that some steps in a public decision are not and cannot be explained. So, for example, consider the case of a police officer stopping me here for drunk driving. And one of the steps in the decision of giving me a fine, for example, would be for the police officers to check my driver's license and make sure that I am the person that on the picture of the driver's license. So yeah, so they get the right person. And this step in a decision is typically not explained. The police officer will, if asked at some later time, the police officer will just say, well, he looked like the guy on the ID. So yeah, that step is typically not explained. And it's also a step that is a very clear case of a pattern matching or pattern recognition exercise. So what the police officer is doing is that it's matching my facial features to the facial features on the person on the ID card. So in a hypothetical case where this step in the decision was made by a machine, then that step in a decision would be no worse from the point of view of publicity than it is now. So if you think that it's acceptable the way it works now with a police officer doing this visual check, then we should also accept that machine learning systems could do this step. And finally, we argue also that, and this is also from Cristiano, that there are different kinds of decisions that the public administration can do. And some of them concern our constitutional interests. And exactly what those are, well, that's a matter for debate. But examples of this include, the right of habeas corpus, the right of free speech, and so on, free assembly, and so on. And when those interests are threatened or under consideration, then it's much more important than that the decision process be public. Whereas other decisions are not constitutional interests, but just the interests of the legislative assembly or the democratic assembly. For example, let's say that the democratic assembly wants to raise the child allowance credit for families with many children, say. And then you need to have some decision maker that needs to, make an assessment of whether this child is my child, for example. And so it's not my constitutional interest to get an increased child allowance, for example. So in those cases, it would be, you could be more permitting of these partial violations or partial infringements of the principle of publicity. Yeah, that was the end of slideshow. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Karim. Yeah, if you could stop sharing the screen, then we don't see ourselves twice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that helps. Right, so feel free to raise a hand or post questions in the chat. Since no one is doing so just yet, I'll just take the first question. So one thing I was wondering about is if you could say something more about these reasons people are supposed to be giving. So I can imagine that caseworkers, when they estimate the probability of someone getting a job soon, might do this based on previous experience, and so comparing the current case to earlier cases they've seen. So how does that contrast to the statistical inferences you were talking about that aren't allowed, which at least to some degree make similar inferences based on earlier cases?
Yeah. So that would be another example, I would say, of a public decision maker in some cases making an assessment that is very similar to that assessment which a machine learning system would do. Of course, there are also individual particular considerations that the caseworker takes into consideration that are perhaps not part of the kind of data set that a caseworker has. Let's say that someone is a felon, a convicted felon. Then a caseworker would, like, if we think that convicted felons are very rare, so they would perhaps not be in the kind of data set of a caseworker. But the caseworker can take that into consideration when making an assessment. So I would say that in most cases, a caseworker would make an inference based on statistical similarity, but in many cases it would be kind of based on individuals' particular circumstances. Of course, that does not make the decision any good, but that's another question. But yeah, so just to answer your question, the discussions we've had is precisely this, that many decisions are made on this statistical basis, and they are so not by mistake or by there's an explicit instruction from the policymaker or from the legislative assembly that you need to do this, and we've been thinking about that. When there's an explicit mandate from the legislative assembly to make a decision on the basis of statistical similarity, that could also be a set of cases where machine learning can be acceptable, provided that this opacity is not a major problem.
Okay, thanks. André had a question? Or you raised your hand. Yeah.
Yes. Oh. Yeah, I think it works now. Sorry, my microphone was not working. So really interesting presentation. I had a couple of questions. One, in the way in your characterization of reason giving, it seemed a bit restrictive that you would characterize it in terms of rules and laws, a connection between rules and laws on the one hand and some natural facts on the other. Because if you frame it like this, I don't see why the reason-giving property would not be a technical complication when it comes to AI system, as opposed to some sort of structural impossibility. So we can program AI tools in such a way that they do connect some individual property of the case to some law on or general rule. So in that respect, you can make them reason-giving in the sense that or in the relevant sense that you characterized. And second, about public reason giving, I was thinking that there are standard, and this is not so much on the side of the authorities, but depends on how you think about authorities in the democratic context. There are standard or salient democratic institutions such as juries or voting, where we have good democratic reasons not to engage in public reason giving. So, for example, jurors are actually protected from giving reasons for their verdicts, and they're protected against the public in their deliberations, and similarly so for voters. So I was wondering whether there might not be considerations that are similar to those when it comes to the problem at hand. And finally, a question about the reference. I didn't get, is it Dessler, about the Dressler, the types of opacity? If you could just count that, because I find it interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So and this is, I didn't mention this, but in our view, it's a big difference between classical expert systems and machine learning systems in this context, because what an expert system or a classical AI would do is that it would, say, here's a condition. If that condition is fulfilled, then then this is something that we want to do. Yeah, and there are actually expert systems based in Sweden for social insurance compensation. And although those might be good or bad, and there's been some complications with those systems because of this kind of proprietary thing, that they're making verdicts and nobody really knows how the system is working because they don't have access to it. But from the kind of reason giving aspect, it would be fine in our view, because it's not kind of statistical in that sense. You asked also about what public means in this context, or want a clarification. And I think that the jury is a very good example of a case where the reasons are public in one sense, but they're not transparent. So the reasons are accessible. For example, okay, I'm not an expert on the American jury system, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. But the reasons provided by the jury can be accessed by the courts or by lawyers and the prosecutor, perhaps. I don't know. But there is at least an idea that that these reasons can be communicated in some respect. But I think it's an interesting, and especially the other example you gave, voters. The voters, they are protected in all democracies from disclosing what they voted on and so on. But that would be a case, that would not be a case of public decision making. So a voter is not the state, it's not the coercive authority of the state. So the voter is the citizens exerting power on the decision makers. So that they are not kind of included in this requirement. And perhaps now I'm kind of just thinking while I'm talking, and perhaps we should consider juries in the same category as voters in this case, that juries ought not to be considered as representatives of the state, but rather as representatives of the public. I don't know. What do you think?
So I don't want to dwell, but especially for juries, I think the case is clear that they are exercising a public office in that respect. So we might disagree on what voters are, whether that's a civic office and so on. But for juries, it's clear that it is a public office that is filled in with ordinary citizens, and that affects concrete persons directly. And there might be a disanalogy in the sense that their reasons during deliberation, so whatever goes into their deliberations, is accessible in places where they can discuss about the deliberations. And there are a lot of biographies and kind of there's a lot of qualitative research on that. Yeah. But they're not accessible to the judge, with some exceptions where basically they engage in problematic practices. But they can have very weird reasons going in there, and they're not bound to communicate them in any sense. But
thank you so much. This is an interesting case I never thought of. So we need to discuss this. Thanks.
Okay, David also had a question.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for the talk. So I'm not sure I could follow all of it, but I did have a question, or maybe like a point for brainstorming. When you basically compared the decisions that humans need to make and need to be able to provide reasons for, versus the fact that that's hard to do that for algorithms. And I was wondering if you could think along with me, that I have this feeling that kind of we accept the opaqueness, as you called it, of humans, but we seem to in general kind of overestimate or hope too much of technology as being able to, I think Evgeny usually calls it like a tech our way out of the opaqueness. And so I guess I'm not quite sure where I'm heading, but I guess my point is that those are kind of public processes where a lot of the times also the offices that introduce them, be they public or companies, kind of position themselves as this is going to improve our decision making, or this is going to make it much more objective and much more clear, etc. Whereas I think you pointed out many of the issues with that. So maybe I'm asking a kind of meta question. So maybe I think what ought law or public offices, what should they do to kind of, I guess, talk about or frame their use of technologies? Do you have any perspectives on that? Or is my question just too vague? That could also be.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly that we addressed that point. I mean, I think that what we rather want to say is that this idea of public equality, we take it seriously. I mean, in many countries take this very seriously. There's a mention about this, the right to an explanation and so on in many of the EU treaties, in Swedish law also. And those are kind of echoing the sentiment that, if the child protector agency wants to take my child, at least I should get an explanation for why. And that that explanation can not only be, according to some company's secret data set, you are similar to other people who lost their custody of their children. So that's a kind of idea, but of course that's a kind of general intuition, and what we want to do is to bring that down to the complexities of how AI comes into the decision process. So I don't know if it was a good answer to your question, but that's at least the way we try to approach that question. And sorry, I forgot to answer, Andrei. The person is Julia Dressel. And she has an article from, I think, 2016 about opacity. That's yeah.
So Karim, if I can quickly respond. So I think what you're describing lies at the heart of what we try to do with AI tech. So this concept of meaningful human control, being able to somehow, track and trace. So that's part of it lies in the idea that well maybe we could somehow, investigate the algorithms and ask questions and make them more transparent. And I think now we propose several approaches to do so. But I guess the main point is that that I feel that that even if we do that, there's something in us that, as a society or as users, overestimates the technology. And so I guess maybe I'm saying, as a brainstorm, so it's not a clear question, but how do those kind of systemic, impacts of seeing technology as a way to improve decision making? What are your thoughts on that?
So I have a few thoughts, and well, I kind of mentioned some of them there in the presentation, but I think that one of the thoughts is that we can actually reduce some of this opacity. Can be reduced.
Yes.
Perhaps it's, and I think many researchers now are trying to reduce the technical opacity and observational opacity, and that's great. But there are so many layers of opacity that don't have to do with the AI system themselves. Like, for example, this proprietary opacity that companies can say, like, no, we're not going to share our data, or we're not going to share our data gathering practices and so on. So that's kind of an opacity that could be reduced quite a lot by kind of legislative efforts. And also the sociological opacity can also be reduced. If people were more informed about how AI systems work, then perhaps, then that would be a good thing. I can give you an anecdote from this Swedish Public Employment Office, where they had it's fairly easy to know the probability of someone getting a job if they have been registered at the office for a long time, because the probability of you getting a job within the next 6 months is very well correlated with an amount of time you've been unemployed. So the longer you've been unemployed, the less likely it is you're going to get a job. So, okay, that's great. But the problem, of course, is how do you categorize people that are just coming into the office? So then you don't have this data, of course, because, and that's why they developed the algorithm for those cases, because it was a kind of a difficult problem. So here's a person who's been unemployed for 2 weeks. Is this one of those that is going to stay like for many years in the unemployment office, or is this person going to get a job the next day? Great. But the problem is because the bosses do not understand AI, they started using the same algorithm for people that were already unemployed for a very long time. The problem is that the variable being unemployed for 3 years was not part of the algorithm. So of course the algorithm sucked compared with any reasonable caseworker that said like, look, this person has been unemployed for 3 years, and we don't think it's going to get a job in the near term. But since the algorithm did not have that data variable that is super, it's like correlation of 0.7 or something, then and this is not the algorithm's fault, so to speak. It's just the bosses that don't understand how this works. So sorry for that.
Thanks a lot for thinking along with the vague question. Thanks, clear.
Okay, great. And then Volkert had another question.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I missed the first few minutes, so maybe you answered my questions then. I have 3 things to mention, so if that's too much, then we should maybe deliberate after this meeting. I'm studying the use of AI by police officers, so you will understand that I have some thoughts about it as well. My first question is, when you explain the objections to currently for systems not being opaque, you mentioned the opaqueness of machine learning that is based on correlation and not on causation. But what I did not see, but that may be because I missed it, is that it's not context aware, that we do not have general AI, so that things that for people are very, for instance, in the Swedish system, if somebody has cancer and is seriously ill, any caseworker will understand he will not get a job before but if it's not in the system will not see it and will give bad predictions. So that's my first question. Does it play a role in your article or in your considerations?
No, not necessarily. So we're not assessing whether the accuracy or how good an AI system is, but rather this aspect of legitimacy. And of course, there's what the political scientists called process legitimacy. If a decision maker is really bad at what they're doing and consistently produces outcomes that reduces citizen welfare, then that can also undermine legitimacy. But it's kind of another route to that.
Yes, but I think that the lack of context awareness and of common sense, that is a very important reason that the legitimacy of machine learning in public processes should be limited.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but that's my first remark. The second is that you state you have three reasons that machine learning can be applied even if it's you in general should not do it. And one of those is if it's currently not being explained, like you say, recognize a person in a picture, then we don't have to ask it from a machine learning application. I don't agree with that. I think it can be. Sometimes we should ask it. For instance, in policing, currently the selection of people to stop, there is a suspicion that a bias plays a role, racism, and we want to get rid of it. So even though currently we do not have a good explanation why police officers stop certain people and they don't stop other people, we will not accept an opaque system in this way. We want to be sure that this bias that we have think we recognized is excluded. How do you think about this?
No, I agree, and perhaps I was unclear about this. So what we say is that if you replace this step in a decision with an AI system, then the AI system is no worse than it was before. But of course, if you think that this is it's unacceptable that we don't explain this decision, then of course you're gonna think that it's unacceptable that we use AI too. Yeah, so yeah, I agree with that point.
Yes. And the third one is a principle I formulated for the Dutch police. That has to do with risk management, and you could maybe add it in your considerations that detectability and repairability of decisions as well are a factor that can help decide whether you can apply AI or not. And a very easy example is speed cameras. We accept it if there's automated decision taking and automated fines sent to the people, because it's very easy for people or the burden for people to object or to say, no, I have not been there, give me a picture and I can show you that it's not my car. It's quite easy. So it has to do with whether you can recognize that an error has been made and whether you can repair it. And this could as well be applied maybe in other less mundane decisions like legislation or so.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think that this is something that we want to discuss in more detail, and perhaps this is, we are not sure exactly how far to go in this direction in this paper, but this is definitely something that we want to discuss, that we want to discuss, like, what is a public decision and what do we mean when we say that AI is supporting a public decision? So a public decision can, there are a lot of steps before the decision is made, but as you suggest, the decision might not be final because people might ask for appeal for a decision. And that means that we also have to, and this is a good point, very good point I think you made, because that means that we don't only have to consider what happens up until the decision, but we should also consider what happens after the decision and if there is a right to appeal. So just as there can be, it makes a big difference if, let's say, a decision maker has the legal right to deviate from the AI recommendation, or if they don't. So that's a big difference in our view. And of course the difficulty by which you are allowed to deviate from that verdict, because that can vary also a lot, right? For example, in this at the moment in the Swedish employment office, the bosses are trying to force people to comply with the AI recommendation. So a directive has been issued recently, but it was very controversial, so they dropped it, was that they need to comply with the AI system at least 50% of the time, which is kind of, okay, whatever. But that was very controversial because people were very dissatisfied, and yeah. But there are a lot of these back and forths. And what you mentioned is also a relevant aspect of that consideration. Is there an opportunity to appeal? And if so, is that instance of appeal, is that a person, or is that perhaps also an AI? Because that's also possible, right? That it could be another AI that gives you a second opinion or a second verdict. So that's relevant, yeah. You're on mute.
Yes. So indeed, is there an instance where you can appeal? But the other thing is there a way to detect whether a decision was maybe not right? Because some systems are so complex that the human will have no idea whatsoever whether a mistake has been made, or you don't feel you don't know that a decision has been made, so you won't be able to appeal because you don't detect it. For instance, if the police would decide to in their office to do a lot of controls in my neighborhood, I won't be informed about this decision or the reasons for it. Only I think I will feel that sometimes I'm stopped a little bit more than before, but I have no way to appeal because I even don't know that this decision has been made. So that's really Yes, and we have had an AI Agora meeting before where some Douwer presented his research about autonomy of people when using AI systems. Do you know about this?
What was the name?
Douwer. I will put it in the chat.
Aha, Daur. I
Yes.
thought the pronunciation was Daur. Man, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I know.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I think I am familiar with the article.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Thank you for answering.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, if there are more questions, feel free to ask. One thing I was still curious about, sort of as a follow-up on David. Well, Evgeny, you go first.
Thanks, Stefan. Karim, thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. So my question, I think it connects to what David was bringing up. So connecting to what you were telling about this point that, like, when you talk about the things you talked about in your presentation, sometimes people will say, well, humans are also opaque. But then you explained, well, but hang on, what are some of the differences? I'm curious, do you have some thoughts? So you mentioned that some of this comes also from misunderstanding of how the AI functions, and that then so you imply, I think, that comes from people who are not themselves, let's say, technical experts, but maybe they misunderstand how the technology works. But I'm curious, do you have thoughts about how those of us who come from the technical field, how we can do a better job in also being clear to ourselves, but also being clear to the outside world about what what does the technology, what it can do, what it cannot do, what it quantifies, and what does it do with these quantifications and these kind of things. How can we communicate actually better to the outside world to decrease the miscommunication and manage expectations?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, actually, I have some thoughts about this, and this is from a friend of mine who is a professor in the UK, in York University, and he's a professor in machine learning, and he is, he comes from mathematical statistics, from that side, so that he comes from that side, and he thinks, so he tells me, like, for me, it's important that the students understand that what they're doing is mathematics and statistics, right? So he had this course plan where they, explained, like, Dutch books and those kind of, Bayesian statistics and those kind of the basics of understanding what is statistics. But a lot of students were very dissatisfied with this, and they actually went to the prefect and complained and said, like, we don't want to learn about this, philosophy. We want to learn just how to do the apps, so we can get a job. And he was he was very bitter about this, because he felt like unless you give up the students kind of a rigorous understanding of what was statistical inference and what that means, the programmers will not understand what they do, and they're going to be kind of reproducing false ideas about machine learning. So I think that one going for, on his view, I think that one important aspect is to have a curricula for programmers or for machine learning developers, young people, that includes these kind of maybe more difficult ideas about the nature of statistics and so on.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks.
Okay, well, very quickly then. So one thing I was still wondering about is if we manage to have more of this technical opacity, if that takes away some of your worries about the reasons-giving aspects of machine learning, or if this is purely because it's statistics that's problematic. So let's say if we have feature importance methods and we can point to specific aspects of an application, why it's deemed as unlikely that this person will get a new job, does that solve part of the issues around giving reasons for the decision? Or is there just the fact that it's fundamentally statistics that's problematic?
Yeah, I would say that yeah. Well, I mean, I think we have different views in among us three on this idea. So my idea is that, it's very difficult to be absolutist about what is reason giving, because as some of your examples before, there are many cases where reason giving certainly involves a statistical element, at least when people do it. So I think that, or at least my view is that we need to have kind of a holistic approach to this, that we need to both consider to what extent are these decisions, to some extent, what is this decision reason-based, and the problem of opacity, but also the thing that I mentioned in the end of what interests are at stake. Are these constitutional interests that have to do with personal liberty and so on, or are these principles that have to do with, compensation, like a welfare system compensation levels or safety net compensation levels that can, of course, vary and from depending on what the Democratic Assembly wants. So I think those are important considerations as well. But I think that my political theory colleagues, they're more kind of, no, there needs to be public reason. Yeah, I don't know if that was a great answer, but that's at least the way I see it. That it's difficult to give a kind of universal answer to that question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks a lot. Also,
thanks so much for these comments.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much. I have to actually run to another seminar.